Welcome back to TT Stories, where today I am pulling back the curtain on a nightmare that tested every ounce of my sanity. A battle of attrition that dragged me through the mud of corporate greed and entitlement before I finally watched the villain drown in the very trap she set for me. There is a specific kind of arrogance that comes with a heavy checkbook, a delusion that money can simply rewrite history, erase boundaries, and bulldoze over the sweat and blood of working-class families who have been rooted in the soil long before the luxury SUVs ever rolled into town. I want to take you back to the shores of Lake Norman, North Carolina, to a piece of land that isn't just dirt and water to me, but the very heartbeat of my family's legacy. My grandfather, a man whose hands were permanently stained with diesel grease and who knew the value of a hard day's labor, bought this 3-acre slice of Appalachian heaven back in 1968 for a mere $4,000, building a modest, knotty pine cabin and a sturdy wooden dock that smelled of cedar and summer rain. A place where I spent every childhood July learning to cast a line and listening to his gravelly voice tell stories about looking out for your neighbors. When I moved back into that old cabin full-time after my own life hit a rough patch, seeking the quiet rhythm of the water lapping against the weathered pilings to heal my spirit, I was just a heavy machinery mechanic trying to live a quiet life, perfectly content with my loud, sputtering old pontoon boat and the simple joy of an evening beer on the porch. But peace is a fragile thing, especially when the wolves move in next door. 18 months ago, the dense tree line that protected my sanctuary was ruthlessly gutted to make way for a sprawling, sterile, $2 million modern fortress of glass and cold steel, an architectural anomaly that looked like a tech billionaire's spaceship crash-landed on our rustic shoreline. And with that monstrosity came Eleanor Vance, a former corporate litigator who treated our tight-knit, unincorporated community like her own personal fiefdom, a woman with perfectly manicured nails, eyes that judged you before you even spoke, and a silver Porsche Cayenne that she drove down our narrow, shared gravel roads like she was trying to run the working class right off the map. It started with the microaggressions, the slow, suffocating tightening of the noose, as she filed noise complaints about me running my air compressor on a Saturday afternoon, standing on her sprawling composite deck with a glass of imported wine, glaring down at me as if my very existence was a stain on her million-dollar view. Then came the orchestrated inconveniences, her wealthy friends parking their imported sedans across my driveway during her lavish weekend mixers, blocking my work truck, and when I would walk over, wiping the grease off my hands to politely ask them to move, she would storm out in her designer linen outfits, shrieking about how this was a private road, completely ignoring the fact that it was a shared easement my grandfather had helped pave with his own 2 hands. The air around my property grew thick with tension, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of constant surveillance, and I could feel her cold eyes tracking my every movement, her hostility hanging over the water like a toxic fog. But the real psychological warfare began the day I heard the mechanical, rhythmic beeping of a high-tech land surveyor echoing through the morning mist. She was hunting for a weakness, digging through the bureaucratic red tape to find a way to strip me of the one thing that mattered to me. And 3 weeks later, the trap snapped shut when a thick, registered envelope from a high-priced downtown Charlotte law firm arrived in my mailbox. Its crisp, threatening pages claiming that a newly commissioned topographic study proved my family's dock, the dock where I caught my first largemouth bass with my granddad, was encroaching nearly 20 feet into public, disputed waterfront, effectively declaring that 3 generations of my family had been illegal squatters on our own beloved shoreline. For a terrifying, breathless moment, standing there with the sun sinking below the tree line, casting long, menacing shadows across the water, I felt the cold grip of panic squeezing my chest, the overwhelming fear that this wealthy, connected attorney was going to drown me in legal fees and steal my sanctuary through sheer financial attrition. But then I looked at the old, deep gouges in the wooden pilings where my grandfather used to tie his skiff, remembering the unyielding iron in his spine, and I realized that you cannot let a bully with a fancy letterhead intimidate you out of your birthright. So I descended into the musty, dust-choked darkness of the cabin's basement, tearing through decades of yellowed cardboard boxes until my shaking hands finally found the Holy Grail. There, resting beneath a stack of old fishing magazines, was the original, state-stamped, county-certified shoreline survey from 1968, signed in fading blue ink by the chief engineer of Iredell County, an irrefutable, ironclad document that held infinitely more legal weight than whatever private, paid-off contractor Eleanor had hired to draw lines in the sand. Armed with the truth, I called an emergency war council at the rusty Anchor Diner on the edge of town, a place that smelled of strong black coffee and fried bacon, gathering my own working-class army. My sister Sarah, a sharp-witted legal assistant who could read a property statute faster than most lawyers, slammed her battered briefcase onto the vinyl booth, pulling out legal pads and highlighters, while my best friend Tommy, a marine construction veteran with shoulders like boulders, unrolled structural blueprints, and Martha, our town's retired historical archivist whose sweet grandmotherly smile hid a terrifyingly brilliant investigative mind, adjusted her glasses and cracked open a binder thick with public records. We mapped out a counteroffensive that was going to be as relentless as a rising tide, planning a total reconstruction of my dock that would be so magnificently over-engineered, heavily permitted, and legally impenetrable that not even the Supreme Court could find a fault in it, creating an armored fortress of compliance around my grandfather's land, while Sarah began drafting a ferocious countersuit for harassment that we would hold like a loaded gun. I took out a loan against the clear title of the property, betting everything I had on this fight. And under the cover of the morning fog, Tommy and I began driving the new pilings deep into the bedrock of the lake, the thunderous, rhythmic strikes of the pile driver echoing across the water, a defiant battle drum announcing to the silver Porsche in the glass house next door that the electrician was not going to quietly surrender his home. If I had foolishly believed that my refusal to back down, the undeniable legality of my new construction, and the ironclad county permits proudly nailed to the oak tree in my front yard would make Eleanor retreat to her luxury fortress, I was disastrously underestimating the terrifying, chaotic lengths a desperate, entitled person will go to when they realize they are losing control of the narrative. As the new, beautiful cedar decking of my dock began to stretch gracefully over the deep water of Lake Norman, featuring integrated underwater LED lights and built-in benches that were drawing admiring nods from old neighbors who remembered my grandfather, her harassment campaign mutated from bureaucratic annoyance into outright, unhinged malice. It escalated into a fever pitch when I found myself standing face-to-face with a genuinely apologetic, foot-shuffling County Inspector Davies, who had shown up unannounced while Tommy and I were sinking the final joists, his face flushed with professional embarrassment as he confessed, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves, that a woman matching Eleanor's exact description had cornered him in the municipal parking lot, brazenly sliding an envelope containing $5,000 in cash across the hood of his county truck, offering him a mutually beneficial arrangement if he could suddenly discover non-existent structural violations and condemn my project. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of trying to bribe a public official, a straight-up felony that Davies had immediately reported to the state ethics board, creating a devastating paper trail that was quietly ticking away like a time bomb, was shocking enough, but the madness didn't stop there. Small towns have a circulatory system made of whispers and rumors, and it wasn't long before I heard from the guy who runs the local bait shop that a sketchy, out-of-town private investigator had been snooping around, asking aggressive, intrusive questions about my financial history, trying to dig up dirt on my old debts, and even harassing my ex-wife, desperately searching for skeletons in a closet that was completely bare, proving that Eleanor was burning through cash she couldn't afford just to find a weakness to exploit. Her paranoia and vindictiveness reached a boiling point of absurdity when she managed to file an anonymous, urgent complaint with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, dragging a stern-faced federal agent out to my property on a Tuesday morning under the fabricated claim that my cedar dock was actively destroying a protected, fragile wetland habitat, threatening me with $50,000 in crippling fines. But this is where her arrogance blinded her to her own vulnerability, because while the federal agent was walking my perfectly legal, environmentally compliant shoreline, writing off her complaint as a malicious fabrication, I casually pointed her attention toward Eleanor's pristine, over-landscaped property next door, where a thick, neon green blanket of toxic algae was choking the water, a direct, undeniable result of her high-priced landscapers illegally dumping heavy nitrogen fertilizers straight into the lake ecosystem, a violation that carried its own massive, very real federal penalties. The pressure was clearly breaking her mind, and as the deadline for my dock's completion drew closer, her actions crossed the line from civil nuisance into outright criminality, plunging us into a terrifying new reality when I woke up one crisp, silent morning, walked down to the water with my steaming mug of coffee, and found my heart dropping into my stomach as I stared at the severed, frayed ends of the heavy-duty mooring ropes that secured the floating section of my beautiful new dock. Someone had come into my sanctuary in the dead of night, armed with a utility knife and a heart full of malice, slashing the heavy marine lines, a calculated act of vandalism that would have sent thousands of dollars of materials drifting away into the main channel if the permanent pilings hadn't caught the drift, an act that crossed the $1,000 threshold straight into felony property destruction. But what the phantom vandal didn't know, what Eleanor in her hubris had failed to anticipate, was that part of my war budget had gone toward a state-of-the-art, military-grade, infrared surveillance perimeter, and as I sat at my kitchen table, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute triumph, I watched the crisp, time-stamped night vision footage of her recently fired, disgruntled groundskeeper creeping onto my land at 3 in the morning, executing the sabotage before scurrying directly back toward the sliding glass doors of her glowing modern mansion. The heavy boots of Officer Jenkins crunching on the gravel as he bagged the severed ropes as evidence, muttering about pending grand jury indictments, felt like the turning of the tide, the moment the hunted finally becomes the hunter. But it was a breathless, frantic phone call from my sister Sarah at 6 in the morning, her voice vibrating with a kind of holy shock that finally exposed the rotting, desperate core of Eleanor Vance's psychological warfare. I practically flew into town, bursting through the doors of the diner where Sarah was sitting behind a mountain of printed public records, her eyes wide as she slid a heavily highlighted document across the table, revealing the massive, devastating truth that changed the entire landscape of this war. Eleanor wasn't just an entitled, snobby neighbor obsessed with property values. She was a woman drowning in a suffocating ocean of hidden debt, having fled her previous life in New York with a staggering, six-figure tax lien chained to her name, a catastrophic financial bomb that she had completely hidden from her current mortgage lenders. But the real, cinematic twist, the fatal flaw in her grand design, was buried in the soil beneath her own glass mansion. According to decades-old, buried environmental assessments that Martha the archivist had relentlessly hunted down in the county basement, the exact plot of land Eleanor had paid $2 million for was sitting directly on top of a heavily contaminated, unremediated subterranean plume left over from a 1980s commercial fuel depot, a toxic nightmare that required a mandatory $250,000 EPA cleanup the moment the county found out, a secret she was desperately trying to outrun. Suddenly, the chaotic, frantic puzzle pieces slammed perfectly into place. Her maniacal rush to steal my land wasn't about the view. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to annex my deep water access, artificially inflate the value of her toxic property, and secure a quick, massive flip to an unsuspecting buyer so she could flee the state before the tax authorities and the environmental regulators came to collect their pound of flesh. And every day my dock stood firm, the walls were closing in on her financial ruin. The final showdown arrived not in a courtroom, but under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the Iredell County Commissioner's Hall, a room packed shoulder to shoulder with agitated neighbors, whispering reporters, and uniformed deputies, the air thick with the smell of cheap coffee and impending justice as Eleanor, dressed in a sharp designer's suit, wheeled in a massive presentation board, confidently spewing lies about my family's environmental recklessness and begging the council to tear down my legacy. I let her speak, let her dig the hole as deep as her arrogance would allow, before I slowly stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears, bypassed my notes, and simply plugged my laptop into the massive overhead projector, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing before I hit play. The collective, audible gasp of the entire town echoed off the cinder-block walls as the crystal-clear night vision footage of her hired goons severing my dock ropes played on a loop, followed immediately by high-resolution, GPS-tagged photographs of her illegal fertilizer runoff choking the lake. And finally, projected 20 feet high for everyone to see, the undeniable, state-certified documentation of her secret. Massive tax lien and the toxic waste dump hiding beneath her manicured lawn. The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a ghost, her expensive lawyer whispering furiously in her ear as she frantically began shoving her useless, fabricated charts back into her leather briefcase, stumbling over her own high heels as the council chairman slammed his gavel, ordering an immediate, full-scale environmental investigation of her property, while Officer Jenkins stepped forward to announce the pending felony warrants for the vandalism and the attempted bribery. Watching as she fled the room, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind her like the lid of a coffin on her perfect, fake life. It all unraveled for her with terrifying speed. Within a month, her mortgage company discovered the hidden liens, the EPA issued a catastrophic cleanup mandate, and the bank foreclosed on the glass monstrosity, forcing her to flee the state in disgrace just to avoid seeing the inside of a jail cell, leaving behind a neighborhood that collectively breathed a sigh of relief. Today, I am sitting on the edge of the most beautiful dock on Lake Norman, my feet dangling over the cool, sunlit water, listening to the joyful, echoing laughter of the wonderful new family who bought the remediated property next door, their kids splashing in the shallows where a toxic nightmare used to sit, knowing that I didn't just save my grandfather's land. I saved the soul of this community from a predator who thought a heavy wallet was a substitute for human decency. We held our ground. We used the truth as our shield, and we proved that no amount of corporate bullying can break the spirit of a family that knows exactly what they are fighting for. But as I watch the sunset paint the water in shades of fire and gold, holding this hard-won piece in my hands, it leaves me wondering about the nature of the world we live in today. When the wealthy and connected try to weaponize the legal system to crush the working class, stealing legacies just to pad their own failing bank accounts, is it enough that we simply survive their attacks? Or do we have a moral obligation to destroy them so completely that they can never do it to anyone else? And where exactly is the line between seeking righteous justice and becoming the very monster you were fighting to destroy?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.